Welcome to the podcast. It's the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey. We've got some gothic mood lighting here. We're going to do the Edgar Allan Poe stuff in this episode for sure, and I want you to hang around for that. It'll just be 2 minutes here of sort of reflecting, but I wanted to start the show actually today. I've been thinking a lot about philosophy and about how it has a sort of prestige ranking or rating. I've hinted at this before, but I really think it's true, at least in some respect. Philosophy is a sort of lower ranking thing, in my mind, than literature. I know, it's daring to say that, but that's because I think literature allows for, like, poetry, right? Poetry, which is analogies, which means you can incorporate things like time and psychological metamorphoses and other things that are basically ineffable in philosophical prose. So think of the way like YouTube personalities try to summarize, a Hegel, right? They go, Hegel says that this tension between the social and the individual culminates in a kind of radical break from blah, blah, blah. But it's like, well, did Hegel really say that? And if he did, is that the highest culmination of his thought? Or are we cherry picking a bit here and misrepresenting? And even if we're telling the truth about Hegel, note that it comes in the form of a story, right? As a narrative about what happened first, blah, 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 leading up to Hegel, and then how Hegel participated, and then how he changed history and what his influence was, and so on. It's a narrative, but it's not a self-conscious narrative. It's a crappy narrative. Not, it's sort of worthy of the daily news. Fiction, I think, allows for higher, because more self-conscious narratives to exist. These narratives are self-conscious. They're where every detail is told with great intention and, edited and carefully placed, okay? So let's try to track all of this in today's episode. We're going to deal with Edgar Allan Poe, 19th century. And in the 19th century, there's a lot of transformation happening in the way that people think. And I think Poe was sort of on the leading end of this, and I want us to sort of try to become aware of that. Poe, by the way, spell his middle name with an A, or unfollow me. Next thing. Okay, if you, where should I start with this? I mean, Poe is definitely one of my favorite writers. Okay, up there with Melville and Hawthorne and Borges and Camus. But what do I mean here by writer? In my older age now, I do draw a distinction between the classics, which I hold to be almost sacred, at least in part because of the rare combination of forces that preserved them for us. The deep history, the institutions, the monks and translators, the consistent critical commentary that has made them, the classics, accessible as the centuries have passed. When we read Homer or Aeschylus or Ovid, it's sort of obvious that we must put aside our own expectations and try to accommodate ourselves to their, often very different, expectations and assumptions. Now, a good reader, obviously, I think, approaches Homer with his head bowed, so to speak. Think of how moronic it would be to, read a bit of Homer, read the first 3 books of the Odyssey or something, and then toss it aside and go, yeah, I'm not into it. I like reading spy novels, or whatever, or sci-fi, or romance novels. Okay, you like spy novels, but I mean, here's one of the almost unimaginably thin, tiny slices we have of life from a whole other civilization. And, you're going to just toss it aside because, it's not, you can't dance to it or something. If you don't like Homer, I mean, that's your fault, not his. Do you understand what I'm saying there? Anyway, there is, like I said, sort of a distinction between the bards, the composers of the epics who wrote the classics, and on the other hand, the writers who have been trying to write good stuff for us kind of in our own time, which means in our own epoch, right? So if you read Poe and you don't like him, I mean, I suppose that could be reasonable. Like, I allow for differences in aesthetic taste. I think, you're wrong. Like, I mean, what do I mean there? Like, Poe's good. I want you to be able to see this, But like, some people just are on a different wavelength, and I understand that. So you can think critically about Poe if you like. The point is, on this YouTube channel, you have to respect and honor the, ancient classics up through Dante. But when we do the modern stuff, I merely hope, like, rather than insist, that you share my taste. Okay? So, okay, that's enough background. Here's a brief biographical note. I wrote this out, but I wrote it from memory, so if it's a little wrong, forgive me. Poe was born around 1810 and died around 1850. It might have been 1849, just before his 40th birthday, if I remember. It was a weird sort of a death. He was found dead, evidently, in someone else's clothes, I think, although that could have been like the stuff of legend. I think it was like the morning of an election, and I've heard, conspiracy talk that he was, I don't know, like killed for his vote or some crazy thing. Doubtful to me. He probably drank himself to death in some form. He was definitely inclined to alcoholism. And that's an important note for this episode, because drinking oneself to death is going to be an absolutely primo example of what I'm going to talk about here when I talk about sin, and perverseness in a couple of moments. But if there ever was like a functional alcoholic, it was Poe. I mean, this guy was extremely prolific, wrote all kinds of really good stuff. I've talked with a couple of friends recently about the idea of like reasoning from scratch. That is, rather than having to read the whole Western canon before you're allowed an opinion, basically you're going to try to figure it out on your own, because it seems to me like nobody ever really makes any progress anymore. Because as soon as you propose an idea, you get a whole parliament of birds descending on you and squawking, have you read Hegel, or have you read Locke, or have you read Deleuze? Or have you read Pseudo-Dionysus, right? And so on. But guess what? Little known fact. Poe wrote a whole cosmology basically from scratch. He called it Eureka. And it's a description of the origin of things. Poe said it was a poem, but it doesn't read like any poem at all. It reads very modern. It reads like a kind of, I don't know, like you would expect a kind of modern cosmology from scratch to read. And guess what? He more or less described the Big Bang, which is pretty cool since he was like 80 years ahead of the physicists on this point. So that's a check mark in the awesome column for sure. He also wrote loads of book reviews and criticism because he needed the money. This is an interesting side note here about American writers. They've always been a little bit at war with the market, because obviously the market rewards total bullcrap, like, the Da Vinci Code, and it makes it very difficult for anything that aspires to truly higher aesthetic beauty, right, and truth, and those sorts of things. It makes it hard for that to even get into print. And so a lot of aspiring bards, including Poe, had to spend more time than they would have wanted, like generating magazine fodder or working for a custom house, those kinds of things. Anyway, let's continue. Poe pretty much invented the detective story, or perfected it, I mean, this is in addition to writing the cosmology, writing these criticisms. He also would write poetry that I quite like. I mean, Emerson made fun of him, called him the Jingle Man, because his poems often include perfect rhyme and rhythm. But I like it. Poe wrote at least one very good novel called I think it's called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is really fun, and culminates with a visit to Antarctica, where there's like a thermal springs that keeps it seasonally warm, kind of around 40 to 60 degrees, and it's inhabited by a bunch of dark black-skinned people who live down there, and the water runs rainbow colors. It's amazing. But Poe is most famous for his short stories, which are often a very modern blend of horror and abnormal psychology, sometimes laced with like supernatural, gothic, and romantic elements. I've sometimes wanted to imagine that, this is just for fun. I'm not serious here, but like I've wanted to, or this should be serious, I should say. Let me just defend it. That as a PhD in literature, a literal doctor of the philosophy of reading, right? I could maybe be like a kind of shaman to people who, need mental and emotional help, or maybe even suffer from particular physical ailments, right? Where my role would be to kind of meet with them and consult about their problems, and then to prescribe just the right thing to read that would give them like the medical catharsis they need. Isn't that a funny thing? The point with that, like I said, probably not a serious idea, but if this could be pulled off, Poe, as a writer, would be comparable to like a whole family of drugs. He has a story for everything. Sometimes he's funny, like extremely, absurdly funny. And of course, he's insightful and he's psychologically interesting and he's horrific sometimes and so on. I don't have time to do him justice, okay? So I decided to sort of zero in on my favorite thing that he wrote. And yes, I've read pretty much all of Poe. I mean, here's my book of Poe. I guess this is the selected writings, but only because it leaves out like his novel and Eureka and stuff. But this is the Norton or the Norton critical edition of Edgar Allan Poe, edited by one of my dissertation advisors, by the way. And anyway, the idea here is that out of all of that, my favorite thing, The Black Cat, a 6-page short story available as an audio book on YouTube. You definitely should listen to it. And in it, I hope, if you're smart, you start to hear this amazing transition of thinking in the 19th century from what was called like natural philosophy, which was sort of a combination of, it was basically science, which sometimes looked at something like the mind or the human character, and more modern psychology, right? And so Poe is going to try to piece all this stuff together. Sometimes he refers to philosophy, sometimes to the brain science thing, not physiognomy, but where they feel your head, and I forget what it's called sometimes. So this is a lot going on. But in The Black Cat, in like 6 pages, he condenses this transition from essentially like essay writing philosophy, the kind of thing that like even a Hegel might write, and story writing. And I'm going to argue here that he moves into storytelling mode because he had to move into storytelling mode because there was no more, you couldn't go any farther, couldn't make any more progress in philosophical prose. Do you understand that claim? I think that's important to why I like fiction so much sometimes. So, okay, I recently posted an episode of my podcast called The Foundation of Christian Psychology, Romans 7, where I tried to show that St. Paul, articulated some very important claims about the nature of human minds and about human will. Okay? The shortest summary I can possibly give, other than having you watch the video, is just to say that Paul believed that humans sometimes, or even often, knew what the right thing to do was, but they kept doing the not right thing. Okay? They kept doing otherwise. In other words, morality is not an epistemological problem. It is a problem of the will, of self-restraint and those kinds of things, right? Fully cognizant of what is righteous, we often do what is not righteous anyway. That's the claim of St. Paul, okay? So that's where we're headed in this episode. But it's really important that you understand how radical an idea this was, even all the way up until the 19th century. That's amazing because, Paul articulated it in the Bible, but it slipped. People lost a hold of it. And so, like by the beginning of the 19th century, a lot of people had forgotten this. And also, by the way, I should say, like, not everyone agreed with Paul. Even Socrates didn't think it was true what Paul was saying. In Socrates' mind, very famously, no one knowing the good would choose to do evil, or no one knowingly does evil. something like that. I hope you understand the distinction. I mean, listen back to this if you didn't catch what I'm saying here. It's really important. And if you had to make a judgment about which of these two views has come to dominate during our own lifetime in, popular media, I hope you would agree with me. It seems obvious to me that it's Socrates' view, not Paul's view, that is predominant now. In fact, it seems to me the entire edifice of our moral education hinges on the idea that if only we instructed students how to be good, then they would be good, right? So think of the, anti-racist education, which we're just sort of perennially doing in America. Well, it only makes, why, how hard can it be to teach people not to be racist? Just tell them not to do it, and then they'll not do it, right? But what if there are deeper motives, there are deeper inclinations that can't be educated out of us? That's the hunch here. Or better yet, think of the seminars we all now, not just college professors, but everyone has to take at work on sexual harassment, right? Which seem to assume that sexual harassment was, again, merely a problem of a lack of education, right? If only we just tell these ill-educated, boorish men to stop with the sexual harassment, that will fix it, right? Well, what if there's a deeper truth than that? What if human nature poses some limits here? It's not that men only need to be told to stop oogling their female coworkers. Paul thought otherwise. And my argument here is that Poe understood Paul. And I want you to understand Paul. In fact, I think if you can understand Paul, you will be on your way to participating in, if we can create a critical mass here, in participating in ending the sort of virtue signally game thing that has infested civilization. Because if you're aware that you can't, it's not just telling, anybody who has had kids has seen this too, right? You tell your kid, listen, I want you to sit down at the dinner table and say your prayer and say thank you to your mom for cooking it, and then eat with your mouth closed and make polite conversation, So I've told my kids this, why can't they just do it that way, right? Well, it's not that they're not educated, it's that there's something like sin, or what Poe will call perverseness, living in them, right? So again, if you need to, you really should go back and listen to my episode on Paul, and I think it was called something about Romans 7. So okay, I'm getting my book open. I didn't mark the page here. We're going to look at the black cat in just a second, but before I show you Poe's take on all this stuff, I actually want to return for a minute to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is, like so many in the contemporary world, stuck, I think, in that Socratic utopian mindset on the morality question. Emerson wrote in his essay, The American Scholar, and this is a quote, "In self-trust, all the virtues are comprehended." And he reinforces that in his essay, Self-Reliance, where he says, quote, "Trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string." Okay, sort of poetic, but this is extreme Emersonian optimism. It's not even complicated. It's not as complicated as the Byronic heroism, where there's tragedy kind of built into the, the urge to transcend or whatever. And that's the problem, actually, with Emerson. There is no tragedy. There's no danger lurking anymore. But do we really believe that? Do we really believe, oh, now we've finally been educated? I'm trying to think if I want to even go into this, but occasionally I see on Twitter these threads from academics where they're we just need to tell, or lately there's been the thing in the classics, as a discipline about anti-racist and purging white supremacy from the classics. And it's okay, to me, that is just there's no more supremacist act than imagining yourself to be the highest refinement of human history, and then judging from your, elevated perch everything that went before. But they do this with such a lack of self-awareness, with such condescension. There's just like these very like average, very common, scholars, and they're gonna read Thucydides or like Aeschylus or Homer or Aristotle. Aristotle, who, like, I can't remember who said this, like Santayana or somebody said, like, if there's ever to be proof of aliens existing, it was Aristotle's brain. Like, how could a man think this, right? But like, so many academics are ready to just be like, well, in fact, the latest is David Hume. Like, David Hume is a racist. Should we, like, that's problematic, I was messing around actually with that Julian Baggini guy on Twitter today, talking about his tweet where and he's even on the side of like, yeah, we shouldn't quite cancel David Hume. But he's like, but of course Hume was wrong about the racism, which is this like kind of soft and ultimately ineffective, because that will get shoveled in with, oh, he's a white supremacist too, ultimately, right? Everything is. That's not after 2015 or something. And so I asked him sort of trollishly, when did Hume's views on racism get refuted, like technically superseded by the scientific literature? And the answer is they never really did. I mean, we just had like an emotional shift. People were kind of like, I mean, there was no like paper, there was no study proving scientifically, or proving scientifically that racist attitudes in the 18th century were now and permanently from now on like wrong. We just kind of collectively agreed to that. But so if you're asking a philosopher about Hume, it's like, well, where was he wrong? It's very hard to zero in on it, right? You can say, I disagree with him, but that's hardly a reason to cancel him, right? Like, the whole point of reading the classics is to encounter people who think differently than you. So read Hume's essays on the character of the nation states, or what, I can't remember what that's called, the character of the races or something like that. Anyway, you understand where sorry, long digression. Sorry, back to Poe, right? Okay, so we're going to read Poe, and first we're going to start with the Black Cat, okay? Okay, here's the summary of the Black Cat, one of the greatest stories in American literature, I think. This is about a guy. It's narrated in the first person. In fact, I'll even read you the very beginning of this, because he's got this perfect, like, what's this face? Like, just extremely wired personality, probably like neurotic and like paranoid, right? And so it's first person narrative. He's telling his own story. It's not Poe, of course, it's his character, right? And he says, for the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. Right, like, this is the guy who sits down across the table from you, and he's like, are you sure you weren't followed? Right, like, and he's gonna tell you the story, and he's like, listen, I'm not crazy. Okay, so this is that guy. Which means, maybe he's a little crazy, I suppose. But he's not, again, he's not schizophrenic. He doesn't think he's a glass of orange juice. He just has some interesting takes on things. Okay, so this is the narrator of the story. And what happens is, he says, he likes animals. He was very typical and normal guy, functional in his life. Goes out for some drinks one night, and as he comes home that night, his cat, a black cat, he says, I fancied the cat avoided me. So he's coming home drunk from the bar, very late at night, alone. And as he comes in, the cat kind of just like looks at him and walks away or something. Which I think, I've never loved cats, but I think that's pretty common for cats, right? Like, they kind of don't care about, they're not like dogs. They don't run up and want to be pet necessarily. And as a reaction to that affront against him, the narrator takes a penknife and stabs the cat's eye out, okay? Like, yo, yikes, don't do that, by the way. This is a terrible act of malice, and he kind of knows it right away, but he kind of also doesn't do anything about it. Like, he just goes on with his life. He sort of feels bad, but, the next day, basically, the cat is still there, and he has to think about this stuff. So this is where Poe, so he's introduced it with a fictional setup, a story, but now he's going to pause the story and interject a paragraph that really could be right out of, Hegel or like Locke. Okay, he's talking, there's no story. All of a sudden he puts the story aside, he puts it on pause, right? He goes, pause this story, and now listen to what he says in this paragraph. This is so amazing, okay? I'm just going to read it to you without interrupting, and then I will comment on it. All right, so stab the cat's eye out. Then he says, in the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But, okay, now watch, but this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit, philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not, 100 times, found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse at my heart, hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin, that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. This guy kills his cat, because he knows he shouldn't. Do you get that? And it gets worse. A second cat shows up, basically the same cat, another black cat. This one has a white mark on its neck or something. And then eventually he tries to kill that cat, but as he's trying to kill it with an axe, his wife breaks in and tries to stop him. And he turns with the axe and kills her now. And it's like, oh my gosh, right? So this is where this story goes. The point is that at the end of it, this guy has not, he basically, and by the way, that I mentioned sin in that essay portion on perverseness, but that's the only mention of sin in this essay. And I think that's what Poe introduces or reintroduces to American intellectual discourse after Emerson is sin, right? You can't trust yourself. You think you can trust yourself? How naive, right? You know that in the back of your mind, you've done one of these things. You've, spit on your mother's carpet just out of spite, or you've killed an ant with a magnifying glass. You've at least thought about turning the steering wheel into the Mack truck, right? Or jumping off the cliff or whatever. These are the thoughts that sort of haunt us. These are the perverse impulses. And Poe identifies correctly, they never left. They're always there. They're a part of how we act and think and do in the world, okay? Now, Poe also has a story called The Imp of the Perverse, which is the impulse, basically, of the perverse, right? And listen to the beginning of this. I mean, I hope you're loving this like I do. And again, if you missed my episode, the last one or two ago, on Paul and Romans 7, these pair together like, the finest wines and cheeses. Like, if you don't have time to listen to that, but you've heard this whole episode on Poe, go listen or go read Romans 7, and your brain, it's one of those moments where you've formed a real connection and you're like, like, I get it. I get this idea. If nothing else, this makes sense. Paul and Edgar Allan Poe communicating, okay? So Poe, at the beginning of The Imp of the Perverse, now watch how, this is a story, or at least it becomes a story, but watch how the beginning of this is pure 18th century, like, Enlightenment, philosophy, okay? There's not even a character here in this one. It's even purer than in The Black Cat. He says, quote, "In the consideration of the faculties and impulses of the prima mobilia of the human soul, the phrenologists have failed to make room for a propensity which, although obviously existing as a radical, primitive, irreducible sentiment, has been equally overlooked by the moralists who have preceded them. In the pure arrogance of the reason, we have all overlooked it. We have suffered its existence to escape our senses solely through want of belief, of faith, whether it be faith in revelation or faith in the inner teachings of the Spirit. Its idea has not occurred to us simply because of its seeming supererogation. We saw no need for the propensity in question. We could not perceive its necessity. We could not understand. That is to say, we could not have understood had the notion of this primum mobile ever obtruded itself, in what manner it might be made to further the objects of humanity, either temporal or eternal. It cannot be denied that all metaphysicianism has been concocted a priori. The intellectual or logical man, rather than the understanding or observant man, set himself to imagine designs, to dictate purposes to God. Having thus fathomed to his satisfaction the intentions of Jehovah, out of these intentions he reared his innumerable systems of mind. In the matter of phrenology, for example, we first determined, naturally enough, that it was the design of deity that man should eat. We then assigned to man an organ of alimentiveness, and this organ is the scourge by which deity compels man to his food. Again, having settled it to be God's will that man should continue his species, we discovered an organ of amativeness forthwith, and so with combativeness, with ideality, with causality, with constructiveness. So, in short, with every organ, whether representing a propensity, a moral sentiment, or a faculty of the pure intellect. And in these arrangements of the principia of human action, the Spurzheimites, whether right or wrong, in part or upon the whole, have but followed, in principle, the footsteps of their predecessors, deducing and establishing everything from the preconceived destiny of man, and upon the ground of the objects of his creator. So far, do you get what he's saying here? Is that like we've like backwards reasoned our way for everything that exists and everything we do, but now it's going to stump us. Why is there this one impulse to do wrong when we know right? Do you understand? And this is such a deep, such an important like insight into how humans work that if you neglect it, I propose here, I think with Poe, with St. Paul, that your understanding of what humans are capable of doing, how they're capable of living, being arranged, getting on in the world, will not be complete, will not be realistic, let's say, if you neglect this truth about perverseness as one of the, he calls it the first causes in the human soul, right? Let's see, I'm going to continue here for about another paragraph. He says, it would have been safer if classify we must. To classify upon the basis of what man usually or occasionally did and was always occasionally doing, rather than upon the basis of what we took it for granted the deity intended him to do. If we cannot comprehend God in his visible works, how then in his inconceivable thoughts that call the works into being? If we cannot understand him in his objective creatures, how then in this substantive moods and phases of creation, in his substantive moods and phases of creation? Keep going, keep going. Take a deep breath, pause it, do some push-ups, almost done here. Then he says, induction a posteriori would have brought phrenology to admit, and by the way, he means like psychology here. This is before phrenology had been like, proven false, I guess. So induction would have brought phrenology to admit, as an innate and primitive principle of human action, a paradoxical something which, for want of a better term, we may call perverseness. In the sense I intend, it is, in fact, a mobile, or like a mover, without motive. A motive, not motivert, which it says means an innate cause rather than a particular motivation. Through, again, Poe, through its promptings, through perversity's promptings, we act without comprehensible object. Or if this shall be understood as a contradiction in terms, we may so far modify the proposition as to say that through its promptings we act for the reason that we should not. In theory, no reason can be more unreasonable, but in reality there is none so strong. With certain minds, under certain circumstances, it becomes absolutely irresistible. I am not more sure that I breathe than that the conviction of the wrong or impolicy of an action is often the one unconquerable force which impels us, and alone impels us, to its prosecution, that is, to doing it. Are you following? Like, read this again. It is really incredible to me. One of the things he says here that I want to try to clarify is where he says we act without comprehensible object. Part of this is because in Poe's mind, he was still in touch with the idea that like right action is essentially serving God, okay? That's the telos of human existence. It's like why we're here is to do good, like as a way of honoring the Creator, okay? When you do, like in opposition to God's will, what Paul calls like the will of the flesh, basically, right? You are now, there's no object. It doesn't make sense anymore. Now you've like accepted the nihilistic materialist universe and you're acting essentially as an automaton, like as an animal, right? You're just following your, like, it's like you're a character in a play, I guess, at best. If you want to free yourself, the only way to do that is to live for good reason. And good reason means like for the transcendent truth, like for, God, for beauty, for the good, okay? But Poe is right to indicate that we are continually, and just like Paul says, continually being dragged back into this animal world, this humiliating world of, the flesh, the impulses, and oftentimes like what acts on us is, as Poe says, precisely the announcement of the law. The very fact that it is told to us not to do it is what makes us do it. Do you follow? What an amazing insight. Now, if you have internalized all this, you'll first understand, and I hope appreciate, that part of what Poe is doing here is to challenge directly, and he's doing it self-consciously. I mean, he wrote about this, he's challenging like Emerson's, seemingly kind of characteristically early American optimism, right? Basically like, we're new, we're the new people. We're gonna do a whole new thing here. We're gonna throw out the past and it'll all be good. It's kind of like real-time utopianism. Like that's the first couple generations in America, right? So they throw it all out. But what happens, Poe notices, is that they're basically trying to like ignore the sin element in the room, right? The big elephant in the room is sin, And people like Emerson and William Ellery Channing to some extent, and Whitman and Orestes Brownson, although he later ends up like a Catholic, so he will come back to that idea of original sin being important. But a lot of these early transcendentalists sort of threw out the idea, or like, I don't know, maybe ignored is a fairer way to put it, the idea of sin. Like sin, you have to understand, is not merely a theological doctrine. It is a doctrine of like human psychology. It's real. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, oh, you're an atheist? You're an atheist? Who cares? There's nothing better. There's almost nothing better than sin to talk to an atheist about. Because if you can get them to see that like there is this impulse, why does it exist? We don't know. We don't know exactly. Why is it so difficult to do the right thing? Even an atheist, if he's honest, will be able, like, no offense, atheists down there in the low realms of intellectual, of the intellectual archon. Can you hear me down there, atheists? Like, I'd love to get Sam Harris on here and like talk down to him. But even an atheist, even Sam Harris, I think, would be able to identify and recognize that there does seem to be some real like facet of the human mind that is imperfectible, almost like, and this is where Dostoevsky would take it in Notes from the Underground. Remember we read Notes from the Underground on this show, I don't know, 10 episodes back or something, and he says the same thing, that like the gentleman scientists, the Enlightenment, basically, they want to keep introducing this idea that like, here is the true education finally. Here, now you are enlightened, do the right thing, be good to one another, right? Well, it's not that easy, is it? Like, it's not as easy as Emerson just saying, be like the roses under your windowsill. They make no reference to, past roses or better roses. They just rose. Like, that's just what they are. Well, it doesn't feel like it is like that for humans. Humans seem to have this extra thing going on, which is essentially like rebellion or rebelliousness. And so that's one of the things I'm exploring in this episode. And I think for the next episode, I actually want to keep going and drill down a little more into this to see how this idea evolves as it works into the 20th century. And for example, for a specific example, we're going to talk about Albert Camus', I think it's a 1957 book called The Rebel. And we're going to address his idea of metaphysical rebellion. I've been rereading this book. It feels especially timely. You'll remember that in his youth, I think before he formulated this idea, Camus was more or less on board with like the communists. But in his sort of maturation, he finally realized why this can't be. And part of why this can't be is because of this like perennial rebellious element in human nature. You can't root it out, or you will have done away with humanness. Do you understand? So in its own weird way, it's almost a sacred thing, sin, because it sets us apart. Like the animals don't do this. This is our burden. This is our thing to have to think about. And to try to put it away or brush it under the carpet or not think about it leads you to these crazy, stupid paths like utopian communism or like, the Brook Farm experiment that Emerson and those guys participated in. It never works because you haven't taken a true account of what it is to be human. Read your Edgar Allan Poe. Just read The Imp of the Perverse and The Black Cat, and you'll get it. You guys know the routine. Patreon link is below. Hit me up on Twitter at Godward16 if you want to talk about any of this stuff, or if you have requests for future episodes. The next secret stream for my patrons will be this Friday. I don't have the date on the top of my mind right now. I think the 29th or so. And maybe we can kind of talk about this idea about rebelliousness and sin and refusal, right? Like metaphysical refusal and then political refusal and so on. Here's the outro music. Thanks for coming.